How are we going today, everyone? My name is Rakun. Thank you guys so much for clicking on this video. Before you play Bayonetta 3, this full video is going to debunk the plot holes and the timelines of Bayonetta 1, Bayonetta 2, and is going to even explain who THAT CEREZA is. This is basically a canon continuation of my Witch with Memories theory, so if you do want to check out that video, you are more than welcome to click that link above or in the description below and come right back to this exact point. So without further ado, let's get right into the Bayonetta timeline. The Witch with Mysteries theory. When you play Bayonetta 1 for the very first time, the first time-changing event that I believe is the most significant is when Bayonetta returns the little Cereza back to her own time. Now, in science fiction and in pop culture, I do believe that the sixth-dimensional multiverse route is the most logical and best way to explain time travel. So that means the moment you arrive back in time, you create a new timeline. This gets rid of any kind of time travel paradox. Since the little one was raised by our Bayonetta to be empowered, when she grew up in her new timeline, she was brave enough to keep fighting in spite of her dead mother. Hence why we gave her the name Brave Cereza. Therefore, we theorize that this Cereza in the Bayonetta 3 teaser is the same Brave Cereza that we raised in the first game. Okay, so now we have two logical timelines. Fair enough. Moving forward with the story of Bayonetta 2, Baldur was brought to the present by Lopta, and then they had their little adventure. On Bayonetta and Baldur's last fight in Inferno, they are transported back, notice the apostrophes, to the past by over 520 years ago. This was to the events of the witch hunts. Now, for the past years, most people would think that this is the Brave Cereza timeline. Well, not really. Let's pause. I want to clear up my theory about time travel in the Bayonetta universe. I theorize that depending on which time travel method you use, it determines the way that you manipulate the timeline, which, might I add, is quite the plot device used in many movies and many series throughout history. The most well-known movie that I could allude to is Back to the Future. In one scene, we see Marty McFly disappearing and changing the future that he is in, and in another scene, they diverge timelines into a completely new and unknown timeline. It's just something that happens in pop culture for the sake of cinematic enjoyment and a way to maneuver the movie so that it makes sense. So keep this in your mind while watching this whole video. I'm going to explain each method whenever we need to. So when Lopta took Baldur from the past, it was not from our original timeline or the main timeline. It was actually the second timeline that we created when we returned Brave Cereza. You probably already know that. So let's keep going. In Bayonetta and Baldur's last fight in Inferno, Loki transports them, or actually teleports them, back in time to the witch hunts 520 years ago. But because we use Loki's time travel method, this creates an entirely new timeline. Now hear me out, this third timeline is the one that we progress through in chapters 13 to 15. Now I can prove that this is a completely different timeline that is not timeline 2 or the Brave timeline. In the flashback scene where Lopta traumatizes our Bayonetta, we see Baldur get lifted and transported to the future. This is timeline 2, the Brave timeline. But in this timeline, he drops his holy glaive beside Rosa. And straight away, this Brave Cereza and John come in to rush to Rosa. The holy glaive is still there. This scene we can put right here in the second timeline, timeline 2, fair enough. But then when we play chapter 15, we arrive with Rosa already dead on the floor and blood on Lopta's card. When our Bayonetta and Baldur leave into the future or into their future, that's when the new Cereza and John come in. However, in this vision, the holy glaive is nowhere to be found. Nowhere to be seen. Now you can say that the holy glaive just disappeared through Lumen Sage magic and arrived in the hands of Baldur in the prologue scene of Bayonetta 2. But I can't seem to grasp the fact that these two scenarios are supposedly the same event, but the holy glaive is missing in one of them. So they have to be around the same point in time, but in different timelines where one exists and one doesn't. They also have different time placements of both Cerezas entering. Therefore, this has to be a newly created timeline, Timeline 3. Now in this new timeline, we can say that Bayonetta uses her Umbran Watch to transport herself and Baldur into the future or into the present where we play on to chapter 16. Keep Timeline 3 in your mind. After you beat Asa, there is a scene that has made a confusing plot hole for many fans for many years, including myself. Now at the end of Bayonetta 2, when Balder absorbs Lopta and is transported to the past, there is no doubt he is transported to the main timeline because that's when the events of the first game are triggered. And as we know, he grows up possessed in those 520 years and is only to be beaten by our Bayonetta as promised. As of the latest Bayonetta installments, we see his final demise in the first scenes of Bayonetta 2 where he disappears with Lopta. But Rakun, didn't you say that time traveling creates all these new teleportation and new timelines and your 6-dimensional? This is where there is an exception to the rule. Lopta's time travel method, labeled as a swirly line, can alter the future where you came from, just like how Marty McFly or in that scene in Looper where they are disappearing and they are altering the future. And you can say that Lopta's time travel method manipulates the future and his present because he is cursed by being the evil or the bad side of Loki, and that is why he has that power. I'm not too sure, it's just that that's how this universe works, I guess. So just to explain Balder's situation, I'm going to show you his perspective from the very start of his adventure to his demise. I'll show you. The first thing that we see is in Timeline 2 he receives the lipstick. He is transported to the future, Timeline 1, and has adventures versing Bayonetta and Loki. He is transported by Loki's method to the past, creating and continuing on into Timeline 3. Bayonetta then uses her Umbran watch to transport them to the original timeline to beat Lopta. Or Asa now. Number 5, Lopta possesses Balder and then brings him to the past right after Rose's death, where he stabs the Umbran statue. Remember, note that Lopta's time travel does create and manipulate the timeline of the present and the future. And that's just, plot armor and cinematic plays and all that stuff. Also, I'd like to point out that when Loki used nothingness to take away the eyes of the world from Aesir, this is what he said. Either the world will be destroyed or it will create a new path. Human free will determine which way things go. Now, since the world was still intact, I'm gonna spill the tea, and this is just speculation, I still also believe that the eyes of the world return to their respectful overseers. This fixes the plot hole of Balder having the right eye in Bayonetta 1. He can have the right eye, it's just that nothingness returned the eyes to their respective users. And it's also the reason why they could have summoned Omni without dying. Now, you can also see the eyes of the world right there in her eyes. Now that we got the footnotes out of the way, possessed Balder grows up in those 520 years only to be defeated as promised by Bayonetta. But essentially the main thing to get from this section of the video is that when Loki transported Bayonetta and Balder back in time 520 years ago, it created a new timeline from Timeline 2 into Timeline 3. This is where you play chapters 13, 14, and 15. We still haven't figured out one other plot hole in this universe. What about the Records of Time chapter? People say that it's not even canon. Well, the developer says that it is an alternate universe, and some say it's just a demonstration of what's to come in Bayonetta 2. But for the fun of it, we are theorists, and I hope you'll like this adventure with me. Let's assume that this is canon. I found a way for this scene to make sense in Bayonetta. Hopefully, maybe, this might be a thing for Bayonetta 3. Kamiya said that this is an alternate universe, which is logical, and it's actually better that he said alternate universe. So just to put my thesis out there, the Records of Time is actually plausible. It's not a plot hole. What's a huge thing in this chapter is that we see THAT CEREZA. I say THAT CEREZA because we have 3 Cerezas that are completely different from each other now. So we have our Bayonetta, the one that we know and love, and the witch with no memories. We also have this Cereza, the Cereza in the Bayonetta 3 teaser that we theorize, and the girl that we raised in the first game, the witch with memories. And now we have THAT CEREZA. It's actually someone completely different. Let me explain. Now, for the past few years, people have been saying that the Records of Time Cereza is the same brave Cereza that we raised in Bayonetta 1, who is completely grown up. But I digress. While that is a really plausible theory, I don't think that is quite the case here, as of now. I could be wrong, but as of now, I don't believe so. As of the information that we have gotten from the Bayonetta 3 teaser, we see our theorized brave Cereza be sliced in half by Eggman. Now that can be an allusion to what's gonna happen in the 3rd game, not a literal aspect. This is making my brain melt. I'm just gonna quit this channel, and no. There is still another possibility, another time we can point to. That alternate Cereza that you see in the Records of Time chapter is the Cereza in the timeline that Loki created. Since our Bayonetta and Balder continued their adventures in the past, they diverged from the second timeline to create a completely new timeline that doesn't interfere with the Brave timeline. a third Cereza.
私が会った賢者はおしゃべり好きの男だったけど。
Wait, I can answer that. Oh shit. Whoops. Take a look at this snippet from the developer's commentary from Kamiya-san.
みたいですけども、ここね、背景が一瞬ね、あれが重なってですね、で、世界の目としてね、世界の目としてね。
So, Mr. Kamiya confirmed that the timelines collided with one another during this fight with Jubelius. I remember a comment or a tweet a few months ago on my YouTube channel with Mr. Kamiya saying this word for word, and that is why you see the purple shaking throughout the gameplay. If you can find this, or if you are watching this, please let me know. I remember the post was saying something about the convergence of timelines, but it was either a tweet or a post, but I still got the developer's commentary in there. With this fact confirmed by Kamiya-san, you can argue that our Bayonetta, this Cereza and that Cereza, all experience the exact same feeling at this point in time. In order for the universe to be satisfied with all of this time travel debacle, the memories and therefore the consequences of those experiences converged into one timeline for a brief moment. Hence why that Cereza in the Records of Time chapter could have had the memories of our Bayonetta because the timelines converged into one, remembering a Lumen sage who rambled on for 20 minutes. If you play the Records of Time chapter in Bayonetta 2, you can tell that this is the witch hunt that is happening 520 years ago in the third timeline. But how can she if she has the outfit from... Then that means... No. Another time travel adventure. For some odd reason, the Timeline 3 Cereza travels back in time to meet Rosa. Then that means, according to the six-dimensional law of time travel in pop culture, another timeline was created where her adventure continues. That means, well, this is gonna get really cool. The Records of Time, the end chapter that we played through is an alternate universe, correct? But more specifically, it's a fourth timeline. A fourth logical timeline. Remember, the one that we see in the Records of Time chapter is from the third timeline traveling back to see Rosa. So the fourth Cereza, where is she and what does she look like? Well, this is where things turn a little dark. I can theoretically answer that for you, and the answer lies in the name. Records of Time, the end. Now you can argue that this is the second Armageddon that is happening in an alternate universe, and that's fine, but I believe that this battle in this scene is actually at the end of the darkest timeline. It's the end. A flash of light encapsulates the whole screen, and the scene is covered in a vintage style gradient throughout. This timeline ends here. It could be that this Cereza canonically died, or worse, the world ended. Right here. We have our Bayonetta, the witch with no memories. We have this Cereza, the witch with memories. And finally, we have that Cereza, whom I'd like to call the witch with miseries. We now have two Cerezas on the verge of death. Maybe they're going to need some help. I'm Rakun, and happy theory.